Hello my friends, I'm Jean-Michel Grosjeu and welcome to my second special video. Let's call this new series my opinion videos. Videos in which I try to promote the kind of games I'm passionate about, immersion games. Okay, but before going any further, if you have no idea what I'm talking about, I suggest you watch my first video right away, which explains what immersion games are. A kind of games that are not too fashionable at the moment, a world away from Eurogames so rich in mechanisms and that everyone talks about, but hey, I'm doing my best to bring them back into the spotlight, and that's why I'm making this new video, so here we go. What I'm looking for in gaming, and I know I'm not the only one, and there are plenty like me out there. So what I'm looking for in gaming is to live adventures, to live other lives, other experiences in other worlds. And I know that a huge part of the board gaming community don't share this opinion. Usually, people play games for the intellectual challenge or for the puzzle, or just to share a good time with their friends. And that's the way it is. Everyone is free to expect what they want from board games. But, for my part, I'm looking for stories, and I have some very good games on my shelf that make me dream that I am a wizard or a cowboy or a Roman emperor. Yes, it's cool, isn't it? Great stories, but you might say, for centuries and more, mankind has already invented excellent ways of telling stories. Literature mainly, and more recently, cinema. And so, at the end of this long introduction, you could already conclude, hey, Jean-Michel Grosjeu, if you're so keen on great stories and adventure, go and read some novels, go to the movies, and please leave board games to serious people, engineers and logisticians. So, to make things a little clearer, I have to tell you what brought me here. Because I fell into storytelling and imaginary worlds when I was a kid. Some of you already know that, but in addition to producing long game rules videos on your favorite YouTube channel, I also write novels, French novels, on my spare time. Don't look for Jean-Michel Grosjeu on Amazon, I write under a pseudonym. And I also make literary analysis videos on another French channel called Alchimie d'un roman, a novel's alchemy in English. To keep it short, literature is my broth, and for a long time now I've been obsessed with finding the best way to tell stories. How do you transport a 21st century reader to the deck of a whaling ship, to the Spanish Renaissance, or to a country that doesn't even exist? And beyond that, if we come back to gaming, I happened to discover board games at the best possible time, the 80s, the golden age of so-called simulation games, a time when modern gaming bloomed first from war games, then through the invention of role-playing games, and then there was a mixture of the two that were called simulation games. And so, when I was a kid, before I even imagined I'd ever be a writer, board gaming was the first tool I used to create and live stories. And that's it, that's for the history. And I could also talk about video games, because there's an obvious parallel between the two media, board gaming and video gaming. They grew up together, they borrowed a lot from each other, and the other day I was listening to a video by the excellent Mark Brown on his Game Maker's Toolkit channel. He was talking about the game The Last Guardian and developed a very interesting theory. I'll keep it short and jump straight to the conclusion, but if you'd like to see the reasoning in detail, please check out his video. In a nutshell, here is what Mark Brown says. If, as an author, you're using a particular medium to tell a story, in his case he's talking about video games, then try to highlight the specific features of the medium you have chosen. And Mark Brown shows how the authors of the game The Last Guardian told their stories and their characters with storytelling elements specific to video games and not found in literature or cinema. They told their story in a way that no other medium could. And then my heart skipped a beat. I jumped out of my chair and shouted, "Eureka! This is exactly what fascinates me about immersion games. These games tell stories in a way that neither literature, cinema, nor even video games can. And that's exactly what drives me. I try to see board games as a unique way of telling stories, stories that no other medium can tell. Some great games have already paved the way, and now it's up to us to walk in their footsteps. If you are a designer, a publisher, or a dedicated gamer, let's get to work together. We are going to start right now." Well, that's a nice program, and I suggest we start from the beginning. And the first thing to do is to draw up a list of what makes a board game unique in terms of storytelling. When a board game tells a story, what are the tools it uses that no other medium can? I can think of 4 specific tools, 4 ways in which a board game is different from a novel, a film, or a video game. First, and this is the most obvious, board games are a social affair. Board game stories are stories that you experience as a group of friends. When I read a novel, I'm all alone. At the cinema, I'm pretty much on my own too. If I hear my neighbor's popcorns too much, it's more of an annoyance. Cinema is a kind of multiplayer solitaire. Video games are still solitaire, but a little less so, because there are multiplayer games. But in general, unless you're having a LAN party like in the good old days, you don't really see people you play with, or you see them on video in a small corner of your screen. On the other hand, when I'm playing Stationfall and I activate the death ray to destroy the Astrochimp's escape pod, the Astrochimp is my friend Céline, who's just sitting here, right in front of me, and whose dumbfounded face I see when her shuttle explodes. And I also hear other players shouting around the game table, their laughter, their surprise, the coup de théâtre. Clearly, there's an immediate human emotion in board games that you cannot find anywhere else. Another example, I play Diplomacy or Game of Thrones with my best friends. War unfolds with its dramas and conquests across the plains of Europe or Westeros. And then, inevitably, comes the moment when I betray my faithful ally Tsar Alexander or Ned Stark. The stab in the back, for which these 2 games are famous, the betrayal that would cause my friend Arnaud not to speak me again for several days. What other medium succeeds so well in conveying the feeling of betrayal? It's not an idea, it's not a theory, it's a very real shock that hits you right in the face. And the same goes for the traitor's feeling, that strange mixture of joy, of triumph, but also remorse and a sincere guilt that spoils the victory a little. It's subtle and it's not so easy to put into words. It has to be experienced for real around a game table. Not to mention the endless discussions between Roman senators in Republic of Rome or the dishonest negotiations in Junta or Mega Civilization. Okay, now let's go on with our second idea, what we might call, without fear of sounding a little bombastic, the indeterminism of immersion games. Let me explain. At the very beginning of the beginning, a long time ago, on August 27, 1982, Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone's The Warlock of Firetop Mountain was published. It was the first choose-your-own-adventure book, a worldwide success, and its ambition was clearly to blend a game and a novel. Even today, it is the canonical representative of what might be called paragraph-driven games. In other words, these are some kind of branching novels that can be seen in the form of a bushy tree. At each crossroad in the story, the reader, the player, has to make a decision, either on his own or with the help of a fairly basic game system. He fights monsters, makes luck rolls, and goes on reading with paragraph number 768. And one might even ask whether it should be called a game at all. In fact, The Warlock of the Firetop Mountain was published by Penguin Books, a novel publisher, and is more likely to be found in bookshops than in game stores. In short, if we try to show with a diagram the weight of storytelling in board games, we would place choose-your-own-adventure books on the far left, where we still hesitate between a game and a pure novel. And then, moving to the right of the diagram, we can see how game designers have created new ways of telling stories, new tools that are specific to board games. To the right, we won't find any more novels, but something else, something 100% new. Having said that, please note that my diagram does not show a chronological progression. There are some very modern games that appear on the far left of the diagram, on the same level as The Wizard of Firetop Mountain. Not long ago, I was watching an episode of the very French YouTube channel The Incredibles, in which our friend Joël shared his experience of the game Tainted Grail. This is some of these games we call paragraph-driven games, and they are often considered the pinnacle of storytelling in the board gaming world. And, as Joël tells it, at the end of the campaign, it turns out that he preferred not to play the game anymore because he was a little tired of it, and just read the paragraphs just to get the end of the story. The game itself, the so-called gameplay, was seen as an hindrance to the flow of the story. Put another way, the story told by Tainted Grail moves forward thanks to the paragraphs, not the game itself. It's like a dotted line. You read the text, the story moves forward, and then you must endure some game phase while waiting for the next paragraph. And you come away from the experience feeling like you've missed something. And the reason for this failure, ultimately, is that Tainted Grail tells its story with the tools of another medium, the novel, instead of using tools specific to board games. So much so that the player prefers to read the paragraphs rather than actually play the game. That's not to say the game is bad, but it's at the very left of my diagram, the place where the game hasn't emancipated itself and tells its story with the tools of the novel. Now, moving to the right of the diagram, other games came along that used the paragraphs differently. Not to unfold the story, but just to introduce it, to give it some context. The idea here is that the game designer doesn't impose its own story, rather he creates a world, a setting and characters as deep as possible, and once all this is in place, he lets the players unfold their own story. The paragraphs just set the scene, they give the players their goals and set the stakes. The two best examples that come to my mind are Too Many Bones by Chip Theory Games and Dungeon Degenerates by Goblin Co. In both cases, there's still text to be read, text that's essential for setting the typical mood of these two games. Not to mention the characters, who are defined by the game designers and not by the players. Here is Boomer. She's the tinkerer from Too Many Bones, who cobbles together homemade bombs from monster waste or the wreckage of previous battles. Or the witch smeller from Dungeon Degenerates, whose job is to catch witches before the high priests of the Inquisition and extort a ransom from them. And thus, it's with a head full of rich context that players can play the game with a clear understanding of their goals and stakes. When the game is over and players look back on what they have done, the story they remember is the game they actually played, not the paragraphs they read. the battles, the encounter, their character development. And that's already much better storytelling than the pure paragraph game. And that's why I call it indeterminism. In these games, when the players start playing, what's going to happen to them is not yet determined. No game designer has written their story in advance. The story they are going to live together, they are the ones who will write it. They are the ones who will live it. It sounds like nothing, but it makes all the difference because it creates a true sense of realism. And just like in real life, you never know how it's going to end. It creates a unique feeling that anything is possible and that anything can happen. And that's it. This is the horizontal axis of my diagram, indeterminism. And if we venture even further to the right, we find some games with no paragraphs anymore, games called sandboxes. You won't be surprised to find there my favorite games: Magic Realm, Gunslinger, Station Fall, High Frontier, because all these games have one thing in common. They don't tell a story already written beforehand. They simply create a setting in which players can live out their own story. And that's where you discover a new kind of storytelling, very different from that of novels or films. When you start a game of Station Fall, you have absolutely no idea what's going to happen. And nobody knows, not even the game designer. Just as in real life, players unfold their own adventure without any of them really choosing what twists and turns they take. Players make decisive choices, of course, but some events simply emerge from the game system, thanks to the draw of a card, or the unexpected result of player cross choices, or chains of causes and consequences that no one could have foreseen. Let's take the excellent Magic Realm as an example. When I start playing my first rounds as a wizard, discovering the mysterious world of the Magic Realm, how can I be sure that I won't die like an idiot on my first encounter with a wandering monster after 5 minutes of play? Or who can guess that I'm not going to find the legendary flying carpet that will suddenly make me much more powerful than all the other players, who will then make me their public enemy number 1 for the rest of the game? You'll find a video of a full Magic Realm game session on my YouTube channel. Sorry, this one is in French only, but if you can understand it, it clearly shows that the great epic of a game, and therefore the memories that remain after, is built little by little through the accumulation of small events and decisions. The woods girl who isn't strong enough to carry her treasures and has to recruit dubious henchmen in a shady tavern. The white knight who loses his mind feeling so powerful with his army of paladins. And the greedy sorcerer blinded by treasures and who makes one too many careless mistakes, propelling him to the bottom of the giant octopus stomach. And that's it. We could place all the immersion games we know along this diagram, depending on whether the game story comes more from the game designer's imagination, as a novelist would do, or emerges from the player's interaction with the game system. And we might even be tempted to extend the diagram to the right by adding role-playing games. Because yes, role-playing games are the best we can do in terms of storytelling, aren't they? No. Personally, I don't think so. Or only under some strict conditions. But that's another subject, and we'll probably talk about it in a future video. Okay, indeterminism is great, but this sandbox effect also exists in video games, doesn't it? Yes, it does. You can get the same feeling with those video games that allow players to live their own adventure. But board games add something more, something unique. Board games have rules. In a board game, unlike a video game, you cannot play unless you've first read and learned the game rules. And for many people, this is a flaw of board games. Video games are so much better, aren't they? You play straight away, no rules, no headache, you don't even have to think about it. But this ease is not without consequences. If as a player you start out knowing nothing about how the world works, it's hard for the game to tell a story in which you play the role of a professional, a specialist, a mythical hero. How can you make specialist choices in a world where you are a newbie? In an immersion game, note we are not talking about board games in general but only immersion games, rules are not arbitrary, they are not abstract rules that you have to get into your head before you can play. No, these rules describe the world in which you are going to have adventures. They are real, coherent, and make sense. To read them is already to enter the game's fictional world. I'll take an example to make myself clear. Phil Eklund's High Frontier is a space engineering game. Players play the role of major space agencies' directors, and their job is to launch rockets and explore the solar system. The game, therefore, aims to give us an insider's view of the scientific and human wonder experienced by these men or women in charge of major space missions. But to do that, you, the player, need to know the basics of rocket engineering and government agency management. And that's what you do by reading and learning the rules and watching Jean-Michel Grosjeau's video. And all this before even setting up the game's board and pieces. It's an effort, yes, but first, it's interesting in itself. It's a first dive into the High Frontier universe. And secondly, it's absolutely mandatory if you want to understand the situations you will go through and above all to feel the emotions, the stress, the suspense, the triumph that are linked to this universe. The same applies when you kill the giant octopus in Magic Realm. You know after a few hours of rules that you cannot kill it at first, so you look for the spells, weapons and allies that can finally allow you to defeat the monster. And you do this because you know the dangers, you know the legend of the giant octopus, its modus operandi. You know them in advance, and when at last you kill the monster, you feel infinitely proud because you knew the risks perfectly well. You really were an expert of the world of the Magic Realm, and because you knew the rules so well, you were really afraid in your flesh and blood, because you knew exactly what the odds were that you wouldn't make it out alive. You saw yourself on the brink of catastrophe. Fine, and finally I'd like to mention one last strength of storytelling in board games, and this is the use of slower time. And that's especially a point of difference between board games and video games. In video games, everything comes fast, and the story we're told unfolds in real time. That's not the case in board games. When you play a board game, you sit around the table for several hours, and the action is rarely frenetic. Most of the time, you are just thinking. The best example of this is Gunslinger, Richard Hamblin's second masterpiece. It's a game that recounts great scenes from the historical Far West, great duels, the OK Corral shootout or Billy the Kid's escape. And what makes this game so special is its time scale. A turn lasts 2 seconds of real time. And so you can find yourself playing an entire afternoon, 3-4 hours, only to realize at the end that the duel you've just experienced lasted a single minute. Board gaming is a medium that uses a slower time. It's a medium that seeks emotions that are more intellectual than visceral. Like novels, board games take time to set things down, and when a big crucial dice roll comes, time seems to stop. Players around the table look at each other, they wait, they savor this moment when everything is still possible. I feel there's the same relationship between board games and video games as there is between literature and cinema. In a board game, it's the players who decide how fast time passes. And that's how they best appreciate the story they are living, taking the time to weigh all the possible futures, hopes, stakes, all that can be gained and all that can be lost. And so that's it. This was the first overview of what makes board games so special in terms of storytelling. And now you can begin to understand the dream I've planted in my mind. Board games, or I should say some kind of board games, those that I call immersion games, succeed in making us experience things, adventures, emotions. They succeed in telling us stories from the inside, stories that we live ourselves and not by proxy. They are a kind of games that today belongs to a niche, but one that I'm sure could take off again and add its voice to the great art of storytelling. Personally, I'm convinced that there's still a wonderful land to discover, and not only a land of gaming, but a land of storytelling. There's a place for board games besides video games, but also besides novels and films. Board games shouldn't just be a pastime or an intellectual puzzle, they should be an engine for exploring worlds, eras, characters. And that's the big topic I'd like to discuss in these special opinion videos. The place where we can think together about the great dream of board game storytelling. Don't hesitate to share your thoughts with me. There are so many directions to explore. As I proposed earlier, we can compare board games and role-playing games, for example. We can also see whether the rules that apply to writing a screenplay or a novel would translate to board game creation. And look, here is another interesting topic. What is the use, the meaning of a board game? Is it only to be played? And could we say that the imaginary world of a game goes far beyond the afternoon you spend with your friends around a game table? And so on. Please share your ideas in the comments. I'm looking forward to digging with you deeper and deeper. Allez, au revoir mes amis. Vous avez la bise de Jean-Michel Grosjeu.